All right, so last week we started, we're in the home stretch here, so we got about 3 weeks left, counting today. So last week we started talking through work in difficult places. Okay, so just to kind of remind us where we've been very generally, you'll remember we basically started off saying God, of course, created man in his image, and part of God creating man in his image was that he created him to work. All right, which that's part of how we reflect God himself. God is a worker, he's a creator, and he created us to work. And some of that work, right, really all of it, was meant to be partly how we would fulfill the calling that he had given us, right, to have dominion, to subdue the earth, and all these things to be. You may have heard before the idea of us being God's vice regents, right, meaning that we were going to rule on his behalf, steward his creation, right? And that wasn't meant to make us have big heads or prideful, in our fallen condition. That unfortunately leads to that oftentimes. But it was meant to be something we did in reverence to the Lord and love for him, steward everything he's given us on his behalf, right? In our work. So that's where we were. Of course, the fall happened. It has completely just ravaged work, right? And both in our hearts, the way we approach it, but also just the work itself. Like, work is no longer always pleasing. Right? There's a lot of frustration and toil involved. You plant crops and they don't grow the way they're supposed to. The ground produces thorns and thistles, right? All the things that the Lord mentions when he curses the ground. But the encouraging thing, of course, right, is that we are headed towards the restoration of all things in Christ, right? That Christ has come already now. We are beginning to experience, right, the effects of being new creatures in him, right? There is still much that can be done now in this life, right? Both because of God's common grace, but also because of his redeeming grace in Christ. We have to guard against too much optimism, right? Remember, we're not going to fix the whole world in this life. We're not going to be able to restore our jobs back to exactly how the Lord wants them to be. But we also have to guard against too much pessimism going. Remember that the Lord wants us to have faith in him, faith in what he can accomplish if it be his will. So we're just kind of now working through what does that look like day to day. We've walked through a lot about, okay, what does it mean to be a faithful Christian at work? We kind of zeroed in starting last week on how are we to think about work in particularly difficult places, particularly work in very corrupt places. All right, I think, to be honest, right, in our society, in our culture, more and more work, right, especially where if it works in the employment sense, there's going to be a lot more things to face, right? Not that the heart of man is any worse than it's ever been, right? But there are more corruptions, probably more prevalent now than ever before. And so, just knowing, how do we trust the Lord? Does that mean we run away, or do we press into it? We're walking through all this kind of stuff right now. So let's look through just a few things from last week here. So I'll run through these ones quickly. Believers may remain, this is the main point basically that Dorian in his book makes, believers may remain in compromised or even corrupt places if they can mitigate evil there and if they're not required to sin. All right? The language is very important, right? They may remain in some of these difficult, compromised places, or you don't have to. Right? There's nothing that obligates you to hold a certain job. But a believer can remain in a really difficult, sometimes messed up place if, right, they can bring the evil down there, if they can help restrain evil, and of course, if they're not required to sin while doing it. On the other hand, right, there are times when the godly may or must stand outside morally compromised work and denounce it, right, and take more of a prophetic role in that way. To achieve complete separation from any evil in any organization, is that really possible in this life? No, it's not, right? As long as we are living in a fallen world, right, we always will be in touch with the effects of sin in others, and of course, in our own hearts, right? We would need to break all social contact and become self-contained, right? And of course, we would still have ourselves to deal with, right? So we seek to not sin ourselves, but we recognize that the Lord has called us into the world, right? And that's one of the principles we looked at with Jesus. We'll skip ahead just a little bit here. Jesus did not pray in John 17 for his disciples to be taken out of the world. What did he pray for them? To be kept from the evil one, right? And then he says, as you've sent me into the world, I am sending them into the world, right? And a lot of times, right, when we will see, I think, a lot of that played out is in our work, right? Again, whether it be in our jobs, right? For some of us, that may be happening right in our homes, right, as well. The Lord has sent us into the world, right, in order to be his representatives and take the gospel. Paul forbids us from trying to completely separate ourselves from sinful people, right? He said, I wrote to you telling you not to associate with the sexually immoral of this world, not at all meaning, right, the people of the world. He's saying, but because then you'd have to be taken out of the world, right? Paul's just his common sense approach to things. The Bible shows believers working in very difficult environments, often by serving pagan rulers and maintaining integrity there. So, we looked at a couple examples last week. All right, we had two guys who served Pharaoh. You guys remember who they were? Who were the two guys, both who served a different Pharaoh? Or who one did and one did not? Who were the two guys we talked about? Joseph was one. We'll get to Daniel, but who was the other guy? Moses, right? Joseph and Moses, right? Joseph, we'll remember, right? He was a godly man. Joseph decided to serve Pharaoh, right? Even though pharaohs they were evil guys, right? They claimed to be God and wanted to be worshipped as a god, right? They were not nice Christian rulers, but Joseph still saw fit to serve one of these men, right? Why did he do that? Because he knew it would save many lives, right? And because he saw that this is the most God-honoring thing to do in this particular circumstance. What's interesting, though, we could say, okay, so there it is. That means that a Christian should always serve Pharaoh, right? If you give him the opportunity, you can do good, you should always do it. Well, not necessarily. Okay, what about Moses? Moses, on the other hand, we're told refused, right, the position. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, right? Choosing rather to suffer with the people of God. In that sense, rejected, right, the work that he could have done and had for a different Pharaoh. But both of them, I think the key is, both of them had the same motivation. For both of them, what motivated them, one to stay, one to leave, one was the desire to save lives and a desire to be faithful to the Lord. I'm not always very good at keeping this thing updated, but I'll do my best today. So today, that brings us up to speed. We're going to look today at another couple biblical examples. This one concerning Ahab. All right, so who here has heard of Ahab before in the Old Testament? Right, we've heard of them for all the wrong reasons, right? So among all the kings of Israel up until that point, 1 Kings tells us. You can turn if you want while we're talking to 1 Kings 18 is where we'll look. It covers more than one chapter, but of all the kings of Israel up to the point that he had reigned, right? We are told in 1 Kings 16 that he did more evil than all who were before him. And if you've read the book of Kings and such, that's a pretty big statement because there were some real doozies who ruled throughout that time, right? More than all who were before him did more evil, right? He promoted, other things. He promoted Baal worship and really pushed that heavily. He was married to Jezebel, of course. He did nothing to stop her from doing many evil things, but one of the worst ones being killing God's prophets. And did nothing to stand in the way of that. He showed contempt for God's law by taking whatever he coveted and killing those who stood in his way. You all have heard the story, I'm sure, of Naboth's vineyard, right? Where basically, I see it, I want it, and he doesn't want to give it to me, so I'm just going to, Jezebel, I'm going to take him out, and here we go. So he was a horrible guy. And so it comes to no surprise to us that Elijah, right, is called by God to declare judgment, right, to stand on the outside, right? He wasn't looking for Ahab. He was standing outside his court and as oftentimes living life on the run as a result and pronouncing judgment, right, at one point through drought and famine. That's what God called him to do, to stand outside the evil work, the evil institution, and to denounce it. Right? Now, I think that doesn't surprise us too much, right? I know in my mind that's where I tend to think, okay, what would a faithful Christian do in that circumstance? Well, they would probably stand outside it and and denounce it. I think it's interesting to see there was another faithful guy in this story that we can almost forget about, though. Does anybody remember off the top of their head who was the guy who worked for Ahab? Obadiah. All right, so let's read here for a moment about Obadiah. All right, so this is 1 Kings 18. We'll read through some of these verses. After many days, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the third year, saying, "Go show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth." So Elijah went to show himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria, and Ahab called Obadiah, who was over the household. Okay, so what we hear is that Obadiah was over Ahab's household, right? He was his household manager. And then don't miss the little parenthetical there. Now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly. Isn't that interesting? Here's a guy, he's working for one of the worst kings that Israel has ever seen. And he's managing his household. And apparently, despite what would be extremely difficult working conditions, he's managing to do it faithfully. Right? It says he feared the Lord greatly. We'll see more evidence, right? And when Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, right, she went on a rampage, started killing them off. It says Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50s in a cave and fed them with bread and water. And just think about that, all right? Think about what, you recognize God was sovereign over all this, but what would have happened had there not been faithful Obadiah, right? Working somewhere that I'm sure he did not want to work, right? Think of all just how difficult that would be to have such a wicked king over you, to be managing his household, and yet, fearing the Lord, he saw an opportunity to spare God's prophets who were being killed by Ahab's wicked wife, Jezebel. Right? You can go down a little bit. Verse 7 is Obadiah was on the way, right? He's told to go, and behold, Elijah met him, and Obadiah recognized him and fell on his face. He said, "Is it you, my lord Elijah?" He answered, "It is I. Go tell your Lord, behold, Elijah is here." He said, "How have I sinned, that you would give your servant into the hand of Ahab to kill me? As the Lord your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my Lord is not sent to seek you." Right, so he's afraid he's going to be killed, right? And now you say, "Go tell your Lord," verse 11, "Behold, Elijah is here. And as soon as I have gone from you, the Spirit of the Lord will carry you, and I know not where. And so when I come and tell Ahab and he cannot find you, he will kill me." And he's noticed this. "Although I, your servant, have feared the Lord from my youth." Right? And of course, Elijah promises, "I will be here," right? "Go and do this thing." And of course, it works out in that way. But again, he feared the Lord, it said, from his youth. Right? And Elijah, right, this is kind of an inference, but Elijah doesn't seem to look down on this guy, right, for the work that he's doing. He seems to respect him, right, and to recognize that they both have been given different roles of faithfulness, right? Two very different ones. So, Obadiah worked for Ahab on the inside as household manager, right? And I think this shows us God can ask his people to serve him in contrasting ways, right? The heart stays the same, the motive stays the same, right? We want to love the Lord and love others, but that can be worked out depending on his calling, depending on his purposes in very different ways. Elijah served God by standing outside the king's court, right, and denouncing the evil, while Obadiah primarily served God by staying within the king's court. Right? Elijah's primary goal was to protest, right, the evil, right? I'm not saying that Obadiah never did that, but that was Elijah's primary role there. Whereas Obadiah was primarily called to restrain it, right? To seek to mitigate the effects, right? In this case, to help spare the prophets who were being killed. All right, so what Doriani kind of brings together is if Obadiah could serve God while working for Ahab, right? Then again, going back to our main point, believers may work for almost anyone. Right? If they can serve God, they can resist compromise, restrain evil, and promote justice there. Wayne, go ahead.
I hadn't thought about it before this morning, but in a way that reminds me of the book of Job. He chose to live in Sodom and was vexed by the people there. It doesn't say what he did, but God declared him righteous even though he was in Sodom and destroyed Sodom.
Yeah, Job, you said. I'm sorry, Mike was messing up there. Yeah, that's a good point, right? Job, right, probably lived among a lot of unbelievers, is my guess, and yet there was no one like him as far as someone who feared the Lord and sought to live a righteous life. Yeah, it's a good point. And we have other examples. Job's a good example. What are some other examples, though? All right, so these are a few that we've looked at here of believers, right, staying with the Obadiah theme. Believers who have worked and remained faithful in some really corrupt places. Who else can you think of? Joseph, right? We talked about him. Who else can you think of? Daniel, right? Who did Daniel work for? Nebuchadnezzar, later for a Persian king. What were the Babylonians, what were they known for? They were cruel, weren't they, right? Going out, conquering people, as a lot of them did in those days, right? Of course, all kinds of false gods and all those things. And yet God raised up Daniel, and he was a trusted advisor for the notoriously cruel Babylonian and Persian kings, wasn't he? Remained faithful. Now, it's worth noting, right, we'll come back to this in a moment, right, that we know Daniel, right, that he wasn't just kind of a, climb to the top by whatever means necessary kind of guy, because what was he willing to do? To be thrown to the lions, right? So we know that he was someone who wasn't that he was compromising himself, wasn't that he was just giving in, but he was able to serve and do a lot of good as a believer in a very difficult place. Who else? Daniel is a key one. Who else can you think of? Yeah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? So they were also, right, had a lot of work that they did, and similar to Daniel, were willing, though, also to pay the ultimate price when it came to crossing the line and having to become disobedient to the Lord, right? But they didn't immediately run from those roles they had been placed in, right? They served. They said, well, we're going to do this as faithfully as we can for as long as we can until, right, it crosses a line. We're willing to take the consequences of that at that point. Who else can we think of? Yeah, Cornelius, I hadn't thought about one. The New Testament, it's a good example, right? God-fearing man who, of course, accepted the gospel. Wayne?
Correction, I didn't mean Job, I meant Lot.
Oh, okay.
Lot's
Yeah.
hated son.
There you go. Right, I wasn't quite, I just kind of depended on what you knew right there, but Job probably did live amongst my believers, is my guess, but yeah, there you go. Thanks for the correction. Anyways, Lot, when it comes to, another one would be Nehemiah, right? Nehemiah, what was his job before building the walls? What did he do? He was the cupbearer to the king, right? And that was a high office, right? It's a dangerous office, but it was a high office in those times to hold, and one that you had to be trusted for. And one more that I'm thinking of. Anybody know? Esther is who I'm thinking of, right? So Esther, right, of course. And Esther is such an interesting book because as famous, right? God is not actually mentioned, but you see his sovereign hand at work, right? And that she was able to do much good and to spare God's instrument of sparing the people of Israel. And I think, right, it's also worth mentioning here that we talk a lot when we think about work, right, in our society, right? We tend to think probably more of jobs that we have chosen. But we also recognize believers, right, don't always choose their tasks, do they? Right? Some of you in this room would say, right, I don't work where I work ultimately really because I wanted to, but because it's where the Lord put me. But we see this right in the scripture. So starting back with Esther again. Esther, right, despite how the story's kind of told in Bible stories, she didn't volunteer for a beauty contest. Right? Esther, right, if you read the scripture, right, we were told that the king ordered his official to gather, right, go and get all the beautiful young women. She was taken into the king's palace, it says, and was sovereignly made queen by the invisible hand of God for such a time as this, right? I don't think she wanted to sign up for this. This is something that she was, in a sense, taken captive for, right, and placed there for God's purposes. Joseph, how did he come in? We talked about him a lot. How did Joseph come into his leadership? He was sold into slavery. Okay, so again, Joseph didn't go fill out a job application to be the right hand of Pharaoh. He was sold into slavery. The Lord brought him through many trials and tribulations into that role. And then what about Daniel? This one's interesting. How did he come into his role? He was a war captive. Isn't that interesting? So some of these folks, right, even though they were faithful, right, in these roles, in these difficult places, recognize some of them were placed there against their will, right? They were brought there through some really less than ideal circumstances. All right, so believers may work in some of these difficult, corrupt places, right, if they can remain faithful, and sometimes they just may find themselves there because the Lord has placed them there. But we also recognize that it is permissible at times to avoid these places and to avoid hostility, right, by fleeing. Okay, so what we don't mean to say is that it's ever wrong to leave a difficult place. Okay, why do you think we say that? Do we have any biblical examples of people who fled from some difficult work and it was okay? You think of anyone? Jonah? Well, that was, he had to be course corrected. But yeah, who else can we think of? Who ran from it and it was okay that they ran from the difficulty, the hostility? Paul, right? Paul would be one. It's interesting with Paul. Sometimes he sticks around and just, takes some serious. I mean, at one point he literally goes to Jerusalem knowing, like he knows this is how it ends. I can't explain that, but he does that. Other times, though, persecution breaks out. We've been walking through Acts on Wednesday nights, and he moves right along somewhere else, right, where he knows it's going to be a more profitable place for him to serve, right? We even see Jesus doing this kind of thing, right? Jesus, of course, in the end, gave himself over, right? But we also see throughout his ministry there were times where folks wanted to get him and capture him or whatever, and he took off, right? So there are times when that is permissible.
What would you say about like Ruth and Naomi? Even though they weren't like in a job, certainly they had to do something to survive as widows in a foreign land. I don't know. But they left. They chose to leave that country and come back to the people of God. And I don't know.
Yeah, so I think if I understand your question, like why was it that they left their environment to come to like Israel, what you're asking?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if it applies there, because I'm thinking surely they had to do some kind of work within that country to survive as widows. I don't know.
Sure. I think a piece of that is that in that era of redemptive history, right? In God, it was very much a come and see kind of religion, right? We're a go and tell, right? At this point in the New Testament, right? We take the gospel to people, but in that time, right, to worship the Lord, usually you came to like Israel, to the Promised Land, to the temple. So faithfulness, right, would have looked like a lot of times coming to actually live among God's people. I think is a piece of that there. Yeah, it was a good question. Anything else while we're paused here? All right, well, I think, right, I wish I could put just a silver bow on this and tell you exactly when to stay and when to go. I don't think that's really possible, right? One thing that Doriani points out that I think is helpful, right, sober optimism, right? So I think this kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier, right? We should have hope, right, that God can use me, right, in this difficult place, right? And so we shouldn't be too quick, right, to run the other direction. We'll talk in a couple weeks about calling and hopefully get into maybe a little bit more of the nuts and bolts there. But at the same time, we recognize that there may come a time where we're asking for some wine, where we have to move on, or, right, where perhaps just it becomes so difficult, right, and just the temptation and the difficulty is so great that maybe we do consider moving on. I think that can be acceptable as well, right? We see Joseph, Obadiah, Daniel, Esther, right, all saying it's possible to serve with integrity in a corrupt place, but we also see Moses, Daniel, and Daniel's friends saying that we must say no at times as well. So some general principles, all right? I don't think any of this will be too earth-shattering for you here, but just some general principles to walk through here for working in a difficult place. Man, I'm not very good at this thing. Right? I think we need to be aware of self-deception. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we have to be careful of that? If we taste success, all right, if we're working somewhere and it's going well and we're climbing the ranks or whatever it may be, why do we maybe have to be careful with that? I think because at times if we taste success, the pressure to fit in within a corrupt culture can mount. Right? If we taste, this is what I could have, this is what I'm getting now, this is what I can, accumulate down the road. the pressure to fit in can mount more and more, right? Again, we're not saying progressing your job that's not a bad thing, right? That's a blessing from the Lord when that happens. But we just have to remember our heart is deceitful, right? And to remember that the pressure to fit in will always mount. Have you guys ever read the essay by C.S. Lewis, The Weight of Glory? Anybody ever read that before? It's really, really good. I would recommend it. He talks about the concept of the inner ring. You ever heard this before? That basically any of us in this room right now, right, there's an inner ring of people that we would like to belong to. Okay, there's an inner ring of whoever it may be, whatever appeals to us. Like if I could be among those people, right, I would have arrived. I will have reached a certain, point. And I think that is a really strong temptation for any of us, right? And it can really blind us to some things if we're not careful. So some questions that can help, right, if we find ourselves in this kind of circumstance. Am I serving my king, right, promoting justice, or am I just fitting in and making a living? When potential conflicts between business and kingdom goals arise, do I stand on principle, or do what it takes to keep my job, right? Is my heart set, right? Is it not divided, right? But is it set on the kingdom, right? When conflict arises, or am I willing to compromise? And then, of course, what motivates me? Okay, what motivates me in my work? Is it the opinion of others? Or is it wealth? Or is it love for God and neighbor, right? I think asking ourselves those kind of questions, asking the Spirit to help us can be helpful. We want to seek to be transformed, right? Romans 12, and I think you can say seek to transform where we're at. And not conform. I think it's important to remember, though, this is kind of switching gears a little bit. It's important to remember that sin comes from within and not from without. Okay, let me just explain what I mean by that. Right? Sin, right, when we fall into sin, right, it's never ultimately because of what's out here, is it? It's ultimately because of what's in here. Now, what's out here can tempt us, right? What's out here can be, the means that's used for us to fall into sin. But ultimately, right, we don't ever sin because of our environment. We sin because our hearts are fallen. Yeah, that's an important thing to remember, right? Because we always have a tendency to blame what's out here rather than to recognize what's going on in here, right? I think that's an often missed concept. Let's just read a couple scriptures, right, along those lines. Mark 7, 18 through 23 hits on this in a way. And then James 1, 14 and 15. Does somebody want to read that one for us? James 1, 14 and 15. Any takers? Jim, thank you. All right. So Mark 7, 18 through 23. Jesus, he said to them, then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him? It says it enters not his heart but his stomach and is expelled, thus he quit all foods clean. And he said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man comes evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. Right? So I think that's pretty clear. Right? Where does our sin come from? Right? When I fall into sin, right? What's out here may have tempted me, right? It may have been used, but really it came from in here. Didn't it? That's where it comes from. James makes the same point. Go ahead, Jim.
But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. And after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death.
All right. So when I sin, right, what has overtaken me? My own desires, right, have taken me in and enticed me. Okay, that's what's driving it. So I think that kind of helps explain, right? It is possible to remain faithful to the Lord even when the environment around us is very corrupt, right? Because sin isn't ultimately coming from out here; it's coming from in here. On the flip side, right, this is where we need to have humility, isn't it? Right, to recognize that there may be temptations out here that perhaps I am not able to, at this point in my life, stand. Okay? And just to bear that in mind, right? And even more humility, right? We have to recognize there may be some people who can handle that kind of temptation, and there may be others, right, who can't. Right? There may be some of you in this place who could work in an environment and remain faithful, or maybe I would struggle to do so, right? So it's knowing our own hearts, trusting the Lord for wisdom, not being too quick to run, but also recognizing our own weaknesses. But again, recognizing that sin ultimately comes from the heart, not from what's out here. So that's another thing. We need to remember though, right, the world needs, another thing, these are kind of random, but the world needs believers to labor in every industry where sin and corruption thrive. Okay? I think this is kind of just extending out, again, the principle of Jesus' words, right? As you sent me into the world, I've sent them into the world, right? I really believe this. I think every industry, right, needs Christians working in it to be salt and light, to be trying to reach people with the gospel. And I really hope that we see more and more of that. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, a thought that came to me as you were saying, to know, not being too quick to run, but to also, in humility, know where your heart is and where your weaknesses are. But I think we also have to know where our strength comes from. Because all of us, I think, could say, I'm too weak to be in this place. And probably the examples that we talked about earlier, those men would have all said, I'm too weak to be, you know what I'm saying? But if God puts you there, we also have to be there in faith, knowing that He will also give us the grace to do His will there.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Because otherwise I think none of us would choose to obey God and go into a place if we are only looking at where we're strong and where we're weak.
Yeah, that's a great point. And again, I think that's why we have to be careful that we're not too quick to run, right? Because we can easily, that can almost come out of a place of self-reliance if we're not careful, right? And forgetting the Lord is our help and our strength, right? And I think, right, that the example, right, that we have most clearly, and again, I'm not saying this would always be the case, and I do think the Lord gives us freedom, right? It's not wrong to leave a job, right? If we thought it through and we just want to work somewhere else, that's not wrong. But most of these folks that we're looking at, they were pushed to the point of compromise, right? Before they were willing to let it go, right? They were pushed to the point of, oh wow, this is going to require me to sin against the Lord, right? They didn't just pack it up and try to escape. That's a fair point, yeah. So yeah, we need to remember to that point, the world needs believers to labor in every place. Of course, we should avoid illegal activity, right? And it doesn't need to be said there. And but I think we also need to be aware of practices that are legal and profitable, but immoral, right? I think that's where more of the challenge, right? I don't think too many of us in this room would be tempted to do something illegal, right? Probably, but there might be some temptation to do something that is legal, right, in our system, but that would be immoral in the Lord's eyes, right? We need to allow for advances in knowledge, right, to reshape business activity and safety measures, right? We need to remember that as science progresses, right, some things that would have been ethical some years ago, right, maybe wouldn't be as much now. Like for instance, 80 years ago, asbestos was considered harmless, right? We all know that's not the case now, so we need to be willing to adapt, right, in those ways as well. Above all, we need to be seeking to honor God and to protect others, right? I think if we keep that at our heart, then that would be helpful. Yeah, Brad.
When you talk about being legal but immoral, I know, and I'm thankful for what God has done for me. I'm faced with that a lot. I think we all are in those situations. But almost whenever I step over that line and have, we're at the point where you think, I may not have been above board there or whatever. The Holy Spirit always grabs my heart. So I'm thankful to the Holy Spirit that guides me in those. It's rare that I can ever be faced with those circumstances where the Lord doesn't clutch my heart and say, either that was right or you're heading in the wrong way. You need to look at this way.
Thanks for sharing that, Brad. I'm sure that would be particularly a temptation in the world that you work in, right? Here in the financial world, right? And there's a lot that is. I think about people who work in the tax world, for instance. I think it's very fine, right, to get good and above reproach tax exemptions, of course, and all that is good. I think it's wise to make use of those things. Right, but we all know there can be a temptation to push things to a point where it's legal, but is it really moral? And there's a lot goes into that. Don't come and ask me because I'm not a tax expert. But I think there's some unique pressure for anyone who works in generally financial things. Appreciate that. Yeah, David.
Right, I think the other thing today, because of a lot of the laws that have been passed,
Yeah. remember that God does not leave his people defenseless, right? This kind of goes with Shannon's point, right? Wherever we're at, whatever situation the Lord has put you in, right? Even if it's very difficult, even if you wish and desire, maybe think about escaping it, but as long as the Lord has you there, he promises to not leave us defenseless. So we seek to be faithful, to seek first the kingdom, to trust the King to care for us. All right. Any thoughts or questions before we move along here? That's kind of a lot of stuff thrown at you. Okay, so I'd like to talk a little bit here about difficult bosses and coworkers. All right, so we're going to talk through a little bit of that. I say this in humility because, as you all might guess, I have a really good boss. So I think you all have, some of you have a lot more difficult than I do. I have had in the past a difficult boss, so I relate to some degree. Some principles. These are largely from I mentioned the book, Greg Gilbert's book here, The Gospel at Work. There's a whole chapter on that that goes in more detail of this stuff, so you can check that out if you want to learn more. This is largely from what he says. One, all right, and I think this is hard, but I think it's a good place to start. When it comes to, okay, how do I handle, right, if it's the problem is my boss or my coworkers, one of the first things that we have to be determined not to do, right, determined not to complain, all right, that's really hard. Easier said than done, but like we read Philippians 2, I think it was last week, when Paul says, right, that he wants us to stand out, right, in this crooked generation, right, as lights in the world, I think what is the thing that he says will cause us to do that? Doing everything without complaining and arguing, right, which just amazes me, right? When I think about how to stand out in a corrupt generation, that's not usually what comes to mind, but Paul says if you're not complaining, you're going to stand out, right? Obviously, I trust you'll realize this. I don't mean to say that you could never lodge a complaint, right, when it's appropriate. We'll talk about that in a moment here. But in general, the state of our hearts, right, we determine not to complain. And I think, right, we avoid flattery, of course, but I think we remember that genuine compliments and encouragement can go a long way for people, just kind of as a practical thing there. We seek to submit from the heart to God-given authority, right? I think this is, okay, how do I not complain? What motivates me to not live as a complaining person? I think we have to recognize who is it who put this boss over me? Who is it that put this coworker beside me? It's the Lord, right? He's sovereign over those things. If we go back to Colossians 3:22, right, we're told, right, that as we work, as we labor, right, with those people who are under that authority, we are to do it from the heart, right? Not just outwardly, not just because we have to, but from the heart. It says, bondservants, verse 22, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord, right? With a sincere heart. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, right? Remember, it's the Lord who placed those people over us and beside us. And ultimately, right, we recognize, I don't ultimately serve them. I serve the Lord himself, right? I serve Christ in this difficult situation. I was reminded also of 1 Peter 2. When I was studying for this, we just went through 1 Peter not long ago. Turn there with me if you would, please. 1 Peter 2. If I can get to it here. It says this. Servants, be subject to your masters in all respect. You notice this. Not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. Wow. For this is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God, right? He's saying, okay, it doesn't. What good is it, right? If you sin and are punished for that, of course, right? That's what happens to everybody. But he says, what'll make you stand out is when you do good and you suffer. But this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. Verse 21. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He, as we know, right, he committed no sin. Neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. Right? It's a difficult passage, isn't it? Right? But it's the word of God. right? We are to, even when it's difficult, even when it's unjust, right? Seek to entrust ourselves to the Lord, right? Even as Christ himself did when he suffered unjustly. I think we can remember that our workplaces can be gloriously sanctifying places for us, right? It can be one of the main means the Lord uses to make us more and more like himself, right? I'm sure many of you in this room have experienced that. And ultimately, as a Christian, what is the best thing that can ever happen to us? What is the best possible thing that can ever happen to you and me as a believer? Being conformed to the image of Christ. That is the good of Romans 8, right? The good purpose of God, right? That all things work together for, even difficult workplaces, is be conformed to the image of Christ, right? That's not like, oh man, I wish I knew. No, that's the best thing that could ever happen. To be made like him, right? To enjoy God the way Jesus does, or to glorify Christ is the best thing that could ever happen to us. Another thing, if we're in a difficult spot, seek humility, right? We need to remember that no humiliation we endure will ever make us stoop as low as Jesus did to save us, right? No matter how low we are brought, right, in our work, Jesus was brought lower, right? Jesus left heaven itself, right, and humbled himself to the point of death on a cross, Philippians 2. I think we have to remember that no wrong we receive will compare to the wrong Jesus received. No forgiveness we give will be greater than the forgiveness he gave. So I think you just kind of sum that up. Remember that the gospel is all about treating people better than they deserve, because that's how the Lord has treated us. So we seek humility, right, even as we deal with difficult people. And I think too, right, just along the same lines, be loving. And I think this is where some wisdom is needed, right? Sometimes the most loving thing to do is to overlook an offense, right? It's always most loving to forgive an offense, but by overlook, I mean just by forbear, right? Don't say anything, don't do anything, move on. Sometimes forbearance is the most loving thing. Here's the question though. Is that always the most loving thing to do? Right? Is never saying anything, not speaking up, is that always the most loving thing to do? I see people shaking their heads. Why not? I think this is important. Why not?
Jesus confronted the Pharisees all the time about false religion.
Yeah. Right? So Jesus himself, right, we had times when confronted. We know there are times when it's needed. But in the workplace, right, or wherever your workplace is at, right, if there, why would it might be that it's not loving to say nothing at times? What could happen? Yeah, right? Sometimes, right, sometimes it may be enabling, I think is how I tend to think about it, right? Enabling, again, there's this wisdom, I think we should err on the side of grace for the most part, but there are times where to not speak up, to not talk to your boss, to not deal with this thing, is just to enable someone to continue down something that will be destructive for them, and perhaps for those around them as well. Here's a question for you. Do you guys think, is it ever loving if you're a Christian boss, a Christian manager, is it ever loving for a Christian boss or manager to fire someone?
Yes.
I hear yes. Why do you say yes?
They might be really bad at the job.
Okay. All right. And I assume, right, we want to show patience, but, yeah, okay. What else? Yeah.
It'd be the same thing as, parents who think their kids sing great, if they sound like a wall.
I never experienced that.
And then the teacher will say, oh yeah, it sounds great. Well, at the workplace, it's the same concept. You don't tell the person, hey, you might let me cut off for this, because they're always going to think that they are. They won't
Sure.
learn from it.
Sure. And so wisdom is needed, patience is needed, of course, but, right, in general, right, I think that we have to be careful, about allowing someone to think they're amazing at something, especially if there's an opportunity elsewhere, right? So lots of wisdom is needed, like don't just take that and run with it too quickly, but I think we have to, those are things to be mindful of. But of course, there could be things that are more serious than just not being gifted at something, right? There could be things such as perhaps, again, to let something go would be to enable evil, right? Maybe someone is doing something that's wrong or is really hurting those around them, maybe the reputation, right, in a really important kind of way of the work is at stake. So yeah, anyway, all that's to say, that sometimes the most loving thing to do is to forbear, right, and to let things go. We need wisdom in our lives, but I don't think that means that we don't ever confront things and deal with things. sometimes let people go. Sometimes that is actually the most loving thing we can do for that person. The key is the heart, right? And that makes it harder in a way, because there's not just one clear-cut silver bullet answer to every situation. But the key is the heart, right? What is the most? How do I love this person? What is the most loving thing that I can do for them? All right. So what are we at time? I wanted to talk a little bit about work and technology, but I don't think we have time to do that today. So I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up there. Maybe we'll touch on this a little bit next week. So I hope that was helpful. I think, to be honest with you, it feels there's just so many difficult situations, right? And so I hesitate to speak too specifically to things you may have noticed, but I trust, right, that you all are people who love the Lord, who love His Word, right, who do want to show love even in difficult places and trust the Lord in those environments. And if you'd ever like to talk more, right, certainly feel free to talk to me or any